12:33. All right, I think we can get going. Well, first of all, greetings, everyone. I just wanted to open the day before introducing Professor Gordon Christie by acknowledging the lands on which we stand. I would like to acknowledge, of course, that UBC's Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I'd also like to acknowledge that you are probably joining us today from many places, near and far. And so to also acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Suffice it to say that I'm incredibly pleased to introduce you today to Gordon Christie. He is a professor of law, if you don't know him already, of UBC's Allard Law School, where he specializes in Aboriginal and Indigenous law. It's also equally fair to reference Gordon's talents as a philosopher and a critical legal theorist. I think we'll hear some of that today as well. Gordon is of Inupiat or Inuvialuit ancestry, which is a language group, as I understand it, spans most of the coastal Arctic region of this continent, and with Inuvialuit villages spanning much of the Western Arctic. I first came to know Gordon, at least slightly, when we were discussing a potential research center. Too much to say about that here or now. But instead, I also want to thank Gordon for his contributions to IRES already. For example, his role as postdoctoral supervisor of Nicole Wilson. And Gordon also has an important new book out with the University of Toronto Press, which today's talk will address, as I understand it. It captures his very deep dive into how Canadian law has worked to, in essence, erase Indigenous sovereignty and erode the capacities of Indigenous societies through the medium of liberal positivism. So we will hear that liberal, that thinking on philosophy of liberal positivism, as it really comes to work its way through Canadian law. So Gordon, I look forward to this in more ways than I can say. And to all here with us, please join me in a warm welcome on Gordon's talk today, Canadian Law and Indigenous Self-Determination. Welcome, Gordon.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Terry. It's good to see you. The nice beach you're on there. It's
I know, a local spot.
So as Terry mentioned, I say Inupiat and Inuvialuit because it's kind of an interesting story. This is my mom's side of the family, my dad's side of the family. From my name, you can probably guess is Scott Canadian. My mom's side of the family is actually based around what is today northeastern Alaska, the northern slope of Alaska, which you probably are aware of the recent events around with the previous president, whose name we will not mention, made moves to open that up, oil exploration, the last couple of years. And in the 1940s, my mom and her brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles, and her, my grandparents, her parents, they walked across starting from Barrow, which now has a different name that I won't try and pronounce. It's formerly known as Barrow, Alaska. They walked from there across to the north slope of the Yukon. There's a small part of the Yukon that touches the Arctic Ocean. They were there for a year or two, living across from and on Herschel Island. And then an event happened. One of my aunts had an accident and they needed to go to a nursing station. The closest place was Aklavik, so they went down there. Spent a year or so around there while my aunt convalesced and decided to liked it. So that's how we became Inuvialuit. Inuvialuit are the people who live in the western part of Canada's Arctic. So Inupiat is the group from the northeast part of Alaska. And so my family's Inupiat, but we became Inuvialuit in the early 1950s. That's a bit of how all that works. Okay. So I'm an uninvited visitor to Coast Salish territory. I've been here for quite a long time. And I'm going to try and just talk relatively informally about some things I've been thinking about for the last couple of months. I'm in between projects right now. I've got this one that Kara mentioned. This is the book, Canadian Law and Indigenous Self-Determination. Wrapped it up about 2 years ago. And I've been thinking about the next project, which was meant always to follow from this, but I'm still working out exactly what I'm going to do. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the in-between business that's going on as I start to move in that direction. And it's all pretty much unformed at this point, so it's going to be quite informal, not just in that I'm going to be talking to you informally, but the work itself is being developed. So I'm going to see what I can say today that might make some sense. Any point along the way, if I don't make sense, just stop and I can try and fill things out a bit more. I don't think what I'm going to talk about today is particularly difficult. I think there's going to be parts of this project that are going to get me caught up in some very challenging areas. But today I just want to talk about what I see as an unfolding issue within the scholarship on where Indigenous peoples are in Canada today. And I imagine, knowing a little bit about IRES, that do you guys just say IRES or do you say IRES?
IRIS or IRES is the common language, I guess.
Knowing a bit about you, I'm sure you're well aware of many of the background things that are behind the discussion today, which are the struggles on the land that are unfolding across, especially Western Canada, but even parts of Eastern Canada and the North. So we've got these struggles that are becoming much more visible to the Canadian public. And the ones I've been following, particularly in the last couple of years, the Minnesotan situation, Wet'suwet'en people, and Treaty 8 situation with fracking up there in the northeast part of the province, all the different pipelines, east, west, south, so on. So we know about these land struggles. I think you all know about them. But around that or behind that, there is this debate going on as to how to make sense of all this. And that's what I want to talk about today, because we have movement in certain direction in the last 10 years or so to try and have that debate take on a particular form. And you end up right now at this point in time in 2021 with some tension out there between different scholarly camps. And I just want to talk about that and try and dig into it a bit and see if I can articulate what I think is really going on, because it's presented in one way by one of the camps as being a debate about this, but I think the debate is actually something else. There is a tension there, but it's deeper. So the way into this is to talk about a text that came out a couple of years ago, which I should have on hand, but I don't seem to. Piles of books everywhere. Sorry about that. Let's see if I can identify it as I look around here. A couple of years ago, a book came out edited by John Burroughs and James Tully on reconciliation and resurgence. I think that's the name of the book, Reconciliation and Resurgence. Just a second here, I've actually got a piece I was writing about it recently. I should have a site. I'll look for that. Anyways, it came out a couple of years ago, and it's got a bunch of articles written by a collection of law professors and political scientists, and I think one or two anthropologists. Michael Ash is in there. I think Michael Ash was actually one of the co-editors. So we have a number of people who put this together. There's an introduction by Burroughs and Tully. And I spoke to Michael Ash about this. He said he had no part of it. So it's a Tully-Burroughs introduction. And I'm going to use that as a doorway into this situation. They present a particular perspective on it. They identify two camps of people out there now who are arguing about where we're at in the early 21st century in Canada with Indigenous peoples. And they say that there are basically two groups of intellectuals thinking about this situation. The one group they build up as being interested in reconciliation of a transformative nature. So they label this group a number of different ways, but they tend to focus on this notion of transformative reconciliation. So I'm going to call them that, the transformative reconciliation camp. Opposed to that camp, they identify another group of people. They only identify two people by name, Glenn Coulthard and Audra Simpson. But I think there are a few others in that camp. And I think I may be in that camp. They don't mention me by name, which I'm not sure is a good thing or not. And this camp, they identify, again, with a bunch of different labels, but the one they use a couple times is Resurgent Separation Camp. Okay, so how do they define these two groups? What do they say are the characteristics? Well, the transformative reconciliation group, which is what they're part of and what they think this book is about, right? That book that they're editing, it's accepting the idea of reconciliation, but acknowledging the problems that we face and trying to get to something like meaningful reconciliation. And they think that there's a group of people like themselves who think that reconciliation can be transformative as long as it's shifted in the right direction. And transformative reconciliation will acknowledge that there are problems with the state. And some people would say that's the problem, but problems with the state in not really being willing to talk about meaningful forms of reconciliation. But they still think that there's promise there, that reconciliation is something that needs to take place, and they think it could be transformative. And really it's about the state acknowledging properly the presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So it fits within what you might call the politics of recognition, which is a label you're probably familiar with. It's this, and being that Tully is one of the two, and I think he may have been, my suspicion is he may have been the dominant writer of the two for this introduction. But if you're familiar with James Tully's work in the last 25 years or so, going back to Strange Multiplicities, and then the more recent work on philosophy and a new, public philosophy and a new, I can't remember what the name of that is, a couple of volumes he came out with about 10 years ago. If you're familiar with his work the last 25 years or so, you know that he is advancing a theory about constitutionalism, which fits within this notion of recognition being the key to opening things up. If the state would properly recognize Indigenous peoples, then we're well on our way to transformative reconciliation. The separation resurgence camp, on the other hand, is identified as a group of people who, as they say quite dramatically in the introduction, these people want to dramatically turn their backs against to Canadian society. These are people who advocate, a separate path for Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are focused on the project of resurgence of the traditional forms of authority, legal and political, and in doing that, they're turning their communities away from Canadian society, looking inward, inward in the sense that it's away from Canadian society. So that's the separation part of it. So that they see as problematic, and that's where we start getting into the deeper layers here. What are they really concerned about? The one thing they say they're concerned about is the way in which this debate polarizes the larger community. They mentioned the fact that at the conference that they held in order to get this book project off the ground, there were some harsh words exchanged, I guess. This does happen quite a lot. You get people together to talk about these things, and people do get quite worked up about the nature of the situation today. And they think that this separation resurgence camp is the ones that are creating this polarizing situation that is creating all of this division within the intellectual community, and particularly within the Indigenous intellectual community. And it's not helpful. Okay. Now, beyond that, they also challenge what they see as being the theoretical underpinning of this other group. And that's where I want to take the talk today, because that's, I think, where the interesting stuff's going on. So we know already, I've indicated that the Tully Burroughs group is focused on the coming together of people around dialogue, meaningful forms of dialogue so people can recognize each other and get into some building of a constitution in a different way from the way it's been built in Canada. The separation resurgence group is identified as following some sort of a grand theory. And what this grand theory would be is not entirely made clear, but there are hints as to what it would be, because there's a passage or two, there are 2 or 3 paragraphs where they identify what they see as being one of the problems with the people in this other camp. And here I think they're thinking particularly of Glenn Coulthard, but there are a few others, Howard Adams, for example, and a couple others who followed this path. They explore the decolonizing project in the world in the 1950s and 60s. Glenn's quite interested in this. I think he's writing a book about this now. I think that's what he's been doing the last couple of years. But of course, those Indigenous people who went and explored what was going on around the world at that time, there were people from the west part of Canada, for example, who went to Africa engage with the people who were deeply into this project of decolonization because they were constructing new countries at the time. Well, they almost always had a Marxist outlook on things. And Glenn, as some of you may know, is a proto-Marxist of some form, and he identifies Marxism as a thread running through his recent texts, which I do think I have here. Redskins, white mass. But it's a, it's a new form of Marxism. It's not the old form of Marxism, of course. Not many people hold to the old forms of Marxism, classic Marxism. And in this passage in the introduction of the book, Tolley and Burroughs say that there are elements of that approach to things which are just not only polarizing, but wrong. So this is the interesting part of this. They think that it's a mistake for people to follow people like Coulthard down that path. And they think that built into that approach is this idea that there is a theory which explains everything. This is the grand notion of the theory, right? This theory explains what's going on in some absolute sense. And they I would say, mischaracterize the work that's been going on the last 30 or 40 years as being meant to explain everything about everything. On the other hand, yeah, it is more interesting when they narrow down to what probably is a problem, and that it's very different what the situation was in Tanzania in the 1960s, or Kenya, or any other part of the larger third world that was being decolonized, as opposed to the situation in British Columbia in the 21st century. On the other hand, it's not clear that the kind of theory that Glenn is presenting is meant to just simply explain everything in one global form. It's more a matter of taking insights from Marxist analysis and applying it to the situation in Glenn's case of the Dene in the Northwest Territories. So what going a little bit deeper into it, what is the problem here? Is it that the Marxist theory that Glenn is using is too crude? And that is something that Tolley and or Burroughs say in the introduction. They say, this theory lacks nuance. They say that 4 or 5 times, that it's unsophisticated. I have a hard time with that because I think the theory is relatively sophisticated and quite well thought out. On the other hand, there are elements of it that they identify as being problematic in that it sets people against each other. This is, I think, the core problem they have with this approach to things. They identify an underlying dialectic, right? The process of dialectics comes out of sort of classic Marxist position and is articulated in the 1950s by Fanon and others. This idea that there's the colonizer and the colonized, and then this relationship between them that evolves over time, some sort of a variant of the master-slave dialectic. And this is what Tolley and Burroughs, I think, at the end of the day, find most problematic about the approach of people like Glenn is that it sets out tension between the colonizer, which would be non-Indigenous people in Canada, and the colonized, which would be Indigenous people in Canada. And I think this is what they think is driving people in that camp to turn their backs against Canadian society, because Canadian society would be the colonizers. And they think this kind of way of thinking of the world is problematic because it just sets people off against each other. And what I'm working toward articulating in I don't know if it's going to be a chapter in a larger book at some point or just sort of standalone articles, a breaking down of this argument, because there are parts of it that just don't make any sense. Because I know that Glenn and Audra and there's others, myself included, if I'm in that camp, that we don't have any thought about setting off Indigenous people against settlers, if you use that label. Most of us just don't think of it that much. If we do think of it, we think, well, obviously we want to have everybody together helping Indigenous people achieve a certain degree of self-determination. So there, I think, is the fundamental flaw in the approach right now by Tolley and Burroughs, is that they present it as if they present it as if the other camp is trying to distance themselves from Canadian society, but it's always been about the problem with the Canadian state. it's always been on a political level, not a personal level or a population level. And it's an odd thing because when you look at the chapters in the text by other folk like Kira Ladner and a few of the other Indigenous scholars working in political science and other areas, Aaron Mills is in there, for example, from McGill with a chapter. When you look at those chapters, they get around at some point or other to always identifying what they see as being the fundamental problem, which is the relationship between the Canadian state and Indigenous peoples. And that's been the problem for 150 years. So for Tully and Burroughs to argue that this other camp is problematic because it puts people off against each other, when really the tension has always been in the eyes of the people in this other camp between Indigenous people as political communities and the state as a political community. It seriously mischaracterizes the kind of analysis carried out in the other camp. And what I'm trying to get to eventually is some account as to why the picture has been painted this way by Tully and Burroughs. So at the end of the day, I want an analysis that gets behind the fact that they're doing this to why they're doing this. What are they trying to achieve? Why do they put these kinds of arguments into the world? When I first read this introduction, when the book came out about 2 years ago, I just sat there for a while thinking, why is this here? It's really kind of funny in a way, because in the chapter, in this introduction, they talk about polarizing debates and how bad it is to have people off against each other. And yet what the introduction does is it really drives a wedge between one group of Indigenous scholars and another group of Indigenous scholars. I mean, there's been very little that's been as polarizing, I think, as this kind of way of presenting the matter. And so why are they doing that then? When you step back from it, just looks kind of funny, but it also is very troubling. And here I think, we get to a deeper appreciation of what the positions actually are. It's not the way they're presented by Tully and Burroughs, or even I'd probably imagine by Glenn, although he doesn't think about this project much. It's really one group of people who have accepted what they take to be the reality of the situation. And when I gave a little bit of a synopsis of what I was planning on talking about today, I said there's layers of interpretation we put on the world. That's what I'm interested in. And that's a layer of interpretation, because there is no reality there that they're identifying, or that they're laying on top of our world, a kind of interpretation of it. The interpretation that they lay on top of it is freighted with these terms like reality. This is the reality of the situation. The Canadian state is here. Canadian society is here. Indigenous peoples have to accommodate themselves to it. And the most we're going to get in this world is going to be some sort of transformative reconciliation, which is going to be recognition by the state that Indigenous peoples are peoples, whatever that comes with, which will be determined by and large by the state. Okay. And the other camp are people who, at the end of the day, have never taken that to be a reality. And you wonder, well, how can they not take it to be reality? Because it's not reality again. It's an interpretation put on our world today. There's another version of reality presented by people like Glenn, and I would put myself in that camp with Glenn if you had me in the camp. And I'd be happy to use the term reality too. I say there's a different reality that we present, and you can think of it as another layer of interpretation on the world we live in, but I think it's closer to the actual reality that we live in. Because in that world, what we see as the real situation is that Indigenous peoples haven't consented to the arrangement in Canada today. And in that world, the state can't continue to just presume that it's there and not going to move, and everything has to spin around it. And that's the fundamental tension between these two camps. You've got one camp that is at its heart accommodations. And they may not be happy with that word, but that is ultimately what they're about. They accept the reality of the state as a given, and they're trying to get the most out of the situation as can be. And that may be a very pragmatically good way to think about the world. On the other hand, there are others who, like myself and Glenn, who think, well, but we're not in a world where we have to do that. We don't have to accommodate it. We would only have to accommodate if we agree to the situation, but we don't agree to the situation. We never have. So that's that's where I'm going to try to get to, is that what I think is a fairly clear but deepest level at which this debate is being carried out, even though the debate itself happens on layers above that, where people talk about other things, but they're really signaling that they belong to these two ways of thinking of reality, both of which are not really reality. It's just ways of understanding the past and the present and thinking about the future that come from a different kind of normative grounding. Well, I don't know how long I've spoken for. I don't know when I started.
You know, you started about no later than 12:40, I guess. So you've still got a bit of time here. It's 1, so another 10 to 15.
Well, let's turn this into a bit of a
Yeah.
discussion then.
I would carry on with that last train of thought, because
Okay, sure.
I'm left hanging there. At least I would love to know what you're going to say. Maybe another, comfortably even going till 10 after, another 10 minutes.
Well, the next part of this gets into the kind of ground that I'm still working out, because I have had a sense for practically forever, since I've been thinking about these things, that behind this, behind the one position, which is that the state is just immovable, there's a reason for that beyond the fact that the state just doesn't want to accept that it has challengers to its authority. And that is that the state, while it's a liberal democratic state, has been married with a kind of form of capitalism since its early formation in the mid 1800s. And that ultimately it comes down to different ways of thinking about how we live our lives collectively. Do we live our lives in a world that is dominated by a capitalist economy, or do we allow that there are possible alternatives? And I think that's one of the kinds of realities that Burroughs and Tully are willing to accept. Of all of this within a capitalist economy, there's nothing else we can imagine that we could possibly move toward without revolution, which they're not comfortable with. And then you've got Glenn again, and it's a very interesting chapter here in the middle of this. I think it's the 3rd or 4th chapter in his book, where he talks not so much about politics, but about political economies and the way in which the Dene, in the 1970s were not arguing in their Dene Declaration just about self-determination per se, but they had fleshed it out in terms of an economy. They had in mind a Dene economy. And that was it's an alternative to the capitalist economy. It's not a clear break from it, because at that time in the 70s, the Dene were already caught up in a cash economy. There were certain things they're dependent on. On the other hand, most of their lives at that time were still living on the land. And that's that's seen by a lot of people as being a sort of a non-economical form of life, not in the terms not economical, but a non-economy based form of life. But it's a different economy. It's not a non-economic form of life. And they had actually fleshed out in some of their proposals to the government in the 1980s a way of constructing a Dene land around Great Slave Lake that would have had not just a different set of political structures, but economic structures. They were going to build a interface with a Canadian society based on things like co-ops, which are quite common across the North. So they had this idea that if they're going to have something that meshed with a Southern economy, it was going to be through this interface of having Dene-owned businesses. There would be businesses, but they would all be owned by the community, because it didn't make any sense for them for individuals to own, because that moves you too much into the capitalist world. And so this is, I think, at the end of the day, where we find ourselves in the early 21st century. We've got the Canadian state, which I think thinks that their treatment of Indigenous peoples is the right kind of treatment, because Canada is a liberal democracy, and there's no better way of working out how different groups of people live together than in a liberal democracy. There's that happening. But behind that, there's also this refusal to consider any other kind of political economic vision. And that's the part that I'm interested in, because I think at this point in time, we need something else. We desperately need something else. And it may be impossible, but there are still at least the little tiny slivers of hope when you imagine that Indigenous peoples still have the authority to establish their own legal and political systems, they could try and build up in the world little microcosms of other economies that could challenge the capitalist world at a time when we desperately need something else in place. So that's the part that, you know, is quite vague in my own mind at this point, as I'm just sort of looking around for people to read and things to think about with all the great amounts of time I have to do this. Hopefully in a couple of weeks, you know, my summer times are my scramble times when I try and find what I'll have to read to work out some of these arguments. Okay. Pepper me with questions.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, just terrific to bring up that debate, Gordon. And I have a question, but I'm going to wait for others. But yeah, but thank you for both the pace of your talk, because it sort of allows us all to think with you or think alongside at the right rate. And also, you know, that rightful call, I think, for something else. And what might that look like? Like, yeah, I can't think of anything better to think about right now. So we have a kind of tradition here of letting the floor go to student questions first, and then to the whole group, i.e. faculty and the rest who might be here, just so that, you know, the normal talking heads don't prevail. Mm-hmm. So I will open the floor first. I'll first say thank you and open the floor to questions. And people can use the chat if they want to, and I'll pose your question, or you can raise your hand and we can go that way as well. Justin, please begin.
So first, thanks so much. I really enjoyed that. I really love that you acknowledge that reconciliation is just one interpretation of reality, and that there can be another interpretation centered around the idea that Indigenous people have never agreed to this relationship with the Canadian state. And so I'm wondering if you see a future where the Canadian state no longer exists, and if that's a future that you would strive for if it were realistic or attainable, or if you just see resurgence as something separate.
Well, that's an easy question.
Yeah, I can give an offhand remark, which is not that helpful, which is there will be a time in the future where Canada doesn't exist, but you know, how long that is in the future. I think you mean sort of the foreseeable future. So, you know, in the next several generations, maybe. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think Canada is going to be around for quite a while. I have a, again, I have a whole bunch of things that I'm trying to work out as to how change actually takes place. Because this, again, is a problem I have with the Tully Burroughs perspective on things. You know, looking at Tully's work, the books that I mentioned from the past, they have what I would say is an unrealistic approach to how we make progress, because they really imagine that dialogue will get us there somehow. I mean, his strange, what he calls it, strange constitutionalism, his focus on a different way of imagining constitutional law, imagines that richer forms of dialogue will lead to something different. I mean, theoretically, it makes some sense, but in the practical world, I don't know that having more dialogue is going to actually make much of a difference. Mm-hmm. Because the power at the end of the day, I think, is still really being exercised behind the scenes by the multinational corporations. And they're really good at having dialogue with people that on their end doesn't mean a thing. So I'm trying to work out how we get from where we are today to something different. And you see it again. It's fun to follow. Not fun. It's fascinating to follow the struggles on the ground. That's also frustrating because you see that they never actually get to what we want to have happen. Like right now, the Stoughton camp is there, but the Coastal GasLink pipeline is practically built. Mm-hmm. They're just months away from finishing that. They put these massive man camps in place, and they're just pushing through the woods. And there was, you know, we probably all heard the stories the last couple of days about the investment by the major Canadian banks, part of the banks around the world, and they've actually increased their investment in fossil fuels the last 6 or 7 years since 2016, when they were supposedly, after the Paris Accords, going to pull away from that. Fossil fuel use, is at an all-time high if you go back to just before the pandemic hit, and we'll probably get back to a new all-time high sometime next few months. So it just, the on-the-ground indicators don't look good. So I don't know how, this is the problem I have. I don't know how we can actually get from here to there. I do have a sense of where there would be. There would be a different way of imagining how we do business. I think a lot of people also have a vague sense of where there would be. People think that, renewables, all that kind of stuff like that, all these good things, but nobody seems to have a path from here to there. I think what we're going to end up doing as a global society is we're going to use every last little bit of oil and gas we can until it's no longer economically feasible. And that'll be the only thing that leads to a different world. Will be that 50 years from now, it'll be impossibly expensive to get the last little bits of oil and gas out. And that'll be the only thing that slows down the pipes. So a little pessimistic.
Well, the path to transformation is much on people's minds. Is there a question in the group? Or I'll pose one if there isn't. Harold, go right ahead.
Thank you so much for that talk. Really fascinating it was a real kind of story for bringing us along on your own kind of adventure and kind of grappling with this introduction. I was curious about your talking between, and also relevant to your last point, between like talking about the state versus these indigenous peoples, and seeing the state as the kind of the opposition. And I wonder if, seeing the state as in some ways the acting on behalf of many people and corporations and economic systems, and the degree to which the state is separable from the rest of Canada. And I wonder if that's also part of how that change happens is by leveraging these other factors of people and social movements, et cetera, to bring about change in the state, and kind of connecting the state to the rest of these groups. I wonder if you could speak about that.
Yeah, that's one of the few ways I think that there's some glimmer of hope. And certainly not the only one talking this way. There's many people who've been making these same kind of arguments that in a country like Canada, this may not work in other parts of the world, but in a country like Canada, we do have this story we tell ourselves that the government is there on our behalf, that it's our government that is working for us. And we're all troubled by the fact that indications are that the government actually is working for other sets of interests, for narrower sets of interests. But then if the case is that we have a country built that at least is purportedly acting in the interests of the public ought to be able to wrestle control of it back, if it ever was under control. But we ought to be able to get control over the government if we as a public rise up and say, no, we want our interests being furthered, not the interests of whoever happens to be exploring for oil and gas in different parts of the country. I think that would be a very difficult thing to accomplish, but at least you can see it making sense. In Canada, if 60, 70, 80% of Canadians said, no, we are actually only interested in beginning tomorrow to build an industrial base based on renewable energy, not 30 years from now. It's always 30 years from now. We'll transition there at some point, but the transition always takes 30 years, no matter when it starts. But Canadians said, okay, that's it. We've had enough of this. It's clearly meant to make us think progress is being made. We're just tomorrow going to demand that renewable energy be where all the subsidies go. And no more subsidies. If anything, there's massive disincentives put in place to stop the oil and gas production. That would be the only thing I can imagine having any chance of working. I just don't see again how to get from here to there. Mobilization of the public is what a lot of people are trying to accomplish. But my concern there is I think that the average Canadian doesn't think about these things much. It's unfortunately a realistic and also cynical view what's going on in the lives of most Canadians. I mean, for many Canadians, because they don't have a chance, they don't have an opportunity to think about these things because they're so busy just trying to survive from day to day and month to month. You know, probably many of you found yourselves in those kinds of households when you were young. I grew up in a household where we always just got to the end of the month. The last 3 or 4 days, we were just eating whatever's in the back of the fridge. We never had, and that kind of said you don't have time to be thinking. And if you are thinking about transition to renewable energy, you're thinking, well, that's going to be too much of an unknown. Given that my life is already a struggle, I can't go along with that. And then you get a lot of other Canadians who just don't think about this. You know, we built a society that's wonderfully able to make it possible for most people to never think about anything other than the video game they're playing or the chat thing they're on, whatever. So I hate to be such a pessimistic person.
Well,
that's the point right now. Just I have a hard time seeing now we're going to get things off onto a different path.
well, there are many days where hope seems elusive, for sure. I'm gonna, Layla and I just had a back and forth. We both have questions, and she graciously said, go ahead, so I will. At the end of your talk, I thought you were sort of dangling at that relationship between legal pluralism and economic alternatives. A, is that where your thinking is headed, or B, what is, if any, the relationship between those two possibilities taken seriously, at least, and not trivially?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that needs to come into being in Canada is a form of strong legal pluralism. And this is where I have concerns with a bunch of legal academics again, because there's quite a lot written about legal pluralism, people like Patrick Macklem and a bunch of others. But when you get into the details, you see that they really are talking about weak forms of legal pluralism. You know, having Indigenous law have some sort of an existence within the Canadian state. Everything's subsumed within the Canadian state. But I think a strong form of legal pluralism is what already exists in certain places. Like I think the Wet'suwet'en and the hereditary system is there, it's functioning. And it's not functioning within the Canadian system. It's a separate, parallel, independent system that Wet'suwet'en have had for several thousand years. So descriptively, I think we already live in a world of strong legal pluralism. But the Canadian state, again, is the problem. It doesn't recognize that, and it just goes ahead and puts pipelines through Wet'suwet'en territory. How do we get from the fact that there is a separate, independent legal and political system to something that reflects that?
I mean, in the end, it seems that it exists at the level of jurisdiction and not at the level of sovereignty. So, I mean, is that the difference between strong pluralism, where there is in fact sovereign control, versus consulted control, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, we get some interesting things happening in the world today. We've got the province here in some form or other acknowledging the UN declaration. We've got talks in Canada at the federal level right now about doing the same thing. But if you step back from all that and look at what's going on, in the negotiating rooms, what's happening in the agreements, you see the same old, right? It's Canada willing to allow certain forms of power to be exercised by Indigenous communities where any of those forms of power allowed for have no connection to a different way of being in terms of how you live your life in a wholesome manner. So you can have control over child welfare. Very important thing in practically every Indigenous community. And so people really want to fight for that. But do you have control over the presence of industrial partners on your territory? Of course you don't. It's interesting what the Talbot did a couple of days ago. They basically said, according to their law, there's this one company that just want to say it can't be here anymore. Are they going to be able to make that happen? I think that's an interesting test, right? Because that's the kind of power that Indigenous communities need, is the ability to say, no, we have the final say as to what goes on in our territory, which is an aspect of sovereignty, in the Western model.
Thanks, Gordon. Layla.
Hi, Gordon. Thanks for the talk. I just have something that's sort of a comment, sort of a question, so I'll just put it out there. I haven't been able to read the introduction that you referred to in terms of the argument and how it's laid out, but it sounds like and just based on your comments and responses, a lot of what you're focused on is just sort of basic governance questions and of course the legal dimension in terms of why we should focus on the state, who gets to make decisions, those broad questions around sovereignty as were just addressed. So that seems like it sort of responds to the critique around the polarizing elements of the argument, as you said, just to think about decision-making and sovereignty. But the other thing that I was thinking in that regard, and here it's interesting that Glenn draws inspiration from Fanon, and I'm wondering if you've looked at all some of the Black political thought, abolitionist theory, and some of those debates, and for the parallelisms in terms of the separatist movements, and also questions around abolition and how that might be informative in terms of how some of those discussions have played out in terms of working outside of or refashioning some of these political and legal systems in radically different ways. And as a sort of tag on to that, just based on related to Terry's question, it feels like a lot of what you're pointing to in terms of the need for this refashioning is around the sort of economic alternatives, but also the sort of sustainability crises and the need to fashion sort of alternative modalities or, to take these questions around sovereignty more seriously. And a lot of them seem to hinge on the economic and sustainability. So I don't know if that's a good observation in terms of how you're thinking about it, if that gives you a leverage point to speak to some of those broader issues around resurgence and the need for, real pluralism that addresses these sovereignties in different ways than we see at present. That's sort of my statement / question that I don't know if you want to respond to.
You dropped out just for a second in the first question. Are you talking about Black liberation movements?
Yeah, and that
Okay.
the current debates around abolition, and if there are any interesting parallels in terms of trying to think outside and sort of build radically different types of institutions and politics.
Yeah. When I think of the Black liberation movement in the United States, I think of the kind of story that feeds into my concerns. I mean, they were basically violently put down, and you don't hear much of that anymore. I mean, you hear very little in the 21st century of any kind of Black liberation rhetoric. People nowadays look at Malcolm X and they soften him up. But the Black Panthers, I mean, they were essentially eradicated. So I'd like to think that there could be some parallel synergy between the kind of movements, but the one movement has shown what happens when you go too far, when you actually challenge the state directly. We see the same thing in Canada, in Gustafson Lake and Oka and other places. When you do get to the point where you just stand up and say, no, this is it, we're stopping, no more, then the military comes in, as we saw with Stoughton the last couple of years. So and the second point about sustainability, yeah. I mean, that's ultimately why I'm concerned about it. And to be honest, this is a bit different maybe from some people who talk about these things. I'm not that focused on sustainability as it applies to the human population. I'm worried about ecological systems. I think we're deep into ecological crisis already. We're decades and decades into it. When you look at the way in which the world has already been so severely damaged by us, and with the things that we eat, the things that we grow, and the animals that we enslave and slaughter. And I think sustainability is more than the things I was touching on earlier. I was focused on oil and gas and stuff like that, but sustainability is about getting back to a world where humans are just a part of the natural order, and we're not consumed with this idea that we can control everything and dominate everything. That's a different mindset. And again, I have real problems in seeing how we get there. How do we get to a world where humans don't think of themselves as separate from nature and think about the world as their nest that they have to protect? So I am, sustainability would be a label for the things I'm thinking about, but of a very particular sort. I'm not thinking about how do we sustain a population of 7.5 billion humans on the planet. I think there's way too many. I mean, how do we sustain a population of 1 billion people with the other aspects of the world brought back into some sort of balance? How do we get there?
Thanks. I
know.
mean, it does feel like it's a leverage point because so many other people are looking for what needs to change, and that there is a radical opening that might not have always existed there to rethink some of these political economic systems,
Yep.
which the resurgence, could fit into in different ways. Thank you, Gordon.
Yeah, I'll just make another point about that because I'm aware of a problem on the resurgence side, which is it's not really a problem. It's just a fact of the matter. Not all Indigenous communities who are focused on resurgence are putting their energies into revitalizing, more traditional ways of thinking about economies and the world and so on. And that I think is, in my eyes, is perfectly understandable and acceptable. Some of the communities that are most deeply involved in a project of resurgence are trying to reclaim Indigenous authority in order to go about becoming better capitalist partners in the world. And so that's another thing that needs to be worked out. Like, I don't want to say there's something wrong with that because Indigenous communities have suffered economically within this present system for several hundred years. And if they want to become partners in a pipeline, it's hard to fault them in terms of their position in the world today. But I also wish that we could imagine a world where more Indigenous communities are thinking, okay, we need to get an economy off the ground here, but we also want to turn it in a direction that fits in some way or other with the way we used to think about things.
Thanks, Gordon. I think we can take one last question, and so I'll turn the mic over to Christian, and then we'll close. Christian.
Hi, thanks so much for that talk. It was really wonderful. This is sort of a more maybe pragmatically oriented question. As far as I understand, there are sort of two primary ways that Indigenous peoples have sought to secure sovereignty as it relates to land and resources in Canada, and these have been to either pursue Aboriginal title through the courts or to acquire land rights through the treaty process. And I was wondering if you find one avenue preferable over the other, or I imagine there's an alternative or a number of alternatives that you imagine that might be more advantageous or revolutionary, perhaps. And I was just thinking in a talk that I recently watched that you participated in. You mentioned perhaps leveraging Bill 41, which is this legislative commitment to uphold the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, to facilitate the creation of like novel third-party institutional bodies to address these kinds of questions related to title and resources, because the courts, are not actually technically independent. They're a judicial branch of the state structure and what have you. So I was wondering if, you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I continue to be hopeful about the legislation that is being contemplated and the one we have in place in the province. I don't think anybody will know what comes from that for decades, at least 10 or 20 years. And things are going very slowly in this province, for example. We've had that legislation in place now for about a year and a half or so. So I'm so hopeful though, because the language in the UN Declaration is such that it could open things up. It has quite a few articles that speak directly about self-determination. And the article you mentioned that I think is very hopeful, that imagines some sort of a third-party institution that independently looks at the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples and settle those kinds of questions in a more even-handed manner. In terms of Aboriginal title and land rights and treaties, and both of those, because they tie into what you said at the end of your question, both of those are problematic because they're so deeply embedded in the Canadian system. Aboriginal title is something that is defined by Canadian courts, has been defined by the Canadian courts. What I see hopeful there is that there is a third option, which is a blending of the two, sort of an independent Indigenous authority and the kind of powers you get under, say, Aboriginal title. The Chilcotin, when they got their Aboriginal title in 2014 to a large piece of land up in their territory, what they did just a month or two after is they put in place a park that you're probably familiar with. It's an interesting wilderness park that was designed by them to work biologically in terms of ecosystems. It was very carefully laid out so that a lot of parks in Canada are just sort of thrown out. No reason for why the boundaries are the way they were. But they put that park in place, and it doesn't actually work with what they achieved in that case. They don't have the power in that decision in 2014 to do that. But what they've essentially done is they've said, okay, we won in court, according to the language and according to the notions that you work with in the Canadian legal system. You've acknowledged we have Aboriginal title. Now, Aboriginal title to us actually means something different, right? This is the exercise of Jacotan authority. They say that, we agree that there's such a thing as title. You think of it this way, we this way, and we're going to meet somewhere in the middle here. We're just going to put this park in place. It doesn't quite fit with what you think. It also doesn't quite fit with what we think, because we think we have authority over our entire territory, but we'll work in the middle, right? And that's a kind of third path that I think can be quite helpful. Haida are doing the same thing. They've had a reconciliation protocol since 2008 or 2009. And that's a fun document to look at. Just go online and look at it. And it starts off, the first page, it has 2 columns. One where the Haida assert that they have a jurisdictional authority over Haida Gwaii. And the second column says the province in Canada assert they have. And then after that, they say we agree to disagree. And then move on to this reconciliation protocol. And that's the way to work in the interim. Just acknowledge that we don't agree, that the Haida think that they have authority over Haida Gwaii, the province thinks that they have authority, and just see what you can accomplish given that they don't agree. So there are all these experiments going on in Canada. I think there are some hopeful signs that a lot of people are aware of what the problem is. What the solution is the hard part. I like the Jacotan approach, so that's a good one. We're going to see a lot more Aboriginal title over the next 10 years or so. And I think every community gets Aboriginal title should be thinking the same thing. The day after because they're all going to get something, the day after they should think, what can we do with this according to our law on how we relate to the property?
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Christian. That was a great question. And thanks, Gordon. Ending there with the Chilcotin case and the Haida case and, the emerging role of reconciliation protocol agreements is, just a terrific lens to point out to everyone for sure. Well, thank you. That was a conversation in exactly the right kind of way about really difficult things, and not all of it hopeful, but these are the pieces that just have to be laid on the table and have to move forward somehow. So
we managed to find a little hopeful bit at the end.
Yeah, I know that was true actually, and it is a good place to land. And I've actually been meaning to ask you about that relationship between the park and title, but in the Chilcotin case. Anyway, let me join everyone here and say thank you very much. That was great in both content and pace and style. I really, really appreciate it. You can see all the hands flying up. So I hope you don't get inundated from afterthought questions, but I can't control that. And nice to see you, and thanks very much.
I was going to say that I'm always happy to have a discussion over email with people if they want to send me a question or two. Just the next couple of weeks, like most everybody, I'm going to be still buried under things, but mid-April, things begin to open up a little bit.
It will improve. Okay, thanks again, Gordon. Good to see you and much appreciated.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.